Good morning, chess fanatics. Are you a French defense player or an Owens defense player who is looking for a very solid response against d4, but just isn't really getting it with the mainline options? I may have a solution for you. It's called the Keres defense, or the Kangaroo defense, or the Franco-Indian defense. This is one of my personal favorite openings to play, period, and gives you a wide variety of dynamic options and pawn structures to work with. It takes the fight directly to the d4 player, and calls upon some very solid chess principles as a result. I even made a file detailing my results and research on Chessable, and it will be free eventually on Lichess. So how does it start? It starts with d4, obviously, and e6. e6 isn't very common because if white plays e4, you kind of have to go to a French defense or an Owens defense, or a hippo if you're that kind of person. But essentially, if you already play one of those defenses, this is not a problem, right? And the Keres defense officially starts after they play c4 to claim the center in the main line, and you check them with the bishop. The reason why you do this is because if you wait and just play knight f6 for some reason, they could play a3, right? It's not a very good move, but it does make sure that you have to learn something else if you wanted to learn the Bogo Indian defense. And if you played the Queen's Indian defense against knight f3, then if they play the Catalan, you have to play something else. In this case, it forces the issue, and they have to deal with the bishop immediately. Now then, white has three options. They can block with the bishop, they can block with the knight one of two ways. No sane person is going to block with the queen, and all three of these lead to very different, but ultimately very playable options for black. And furthermore, this is a really nice sideline. Very few d4 players know the specific theory to this, and they can't just be like, oh, it's like the Nimzo or Bogo Indian defense, and then just copy the theory over. It's not. We are faster than those defenses in this line, and we are going to bombard the center as fast as possible. You have to be prepared to play a lot of different pawn structures, and that may not be for some people. However, I believe it is a good way to improve your chess, while learning a pretty offbeat, but still very nice opening. So are you ready? Let's go. Alright, let's start by examining, statistically, the least challenging option in knight c3, blocking the check with the knight. I don't blame you if you want to play knight f6 or f5 and just go for your standard Dutch or Nimzo Indian defense position, but the more independent line is just to strike back immediately with c5. Now, white has a ton of options here. They can play a3, they can play e3, they can take the pawn, or advance, or defend with the knight. You know, all those sorts of things. The reason they can't go e4 immediately is because we take the pawn, and after they take back, we play knight f6, right? They'll play this, trying to attack our knight. We'll play knight c3, knight c6, getting a tempo on the queen, which, I don't know, let's say it goes to there, I guess, to f4. It doesn't really matter too much, actually. We'll take the knight. After they take back, we go here with the queen, right? And being forced to defend with bishop d2, because if we were to take the c-pawn, it would hang the rook with check, and then we would go back and take the pawn if it were to take the knight. So after they defend with that, we take the pawn, they take back, we go here, and our position is so much better that it's actually kind of insane. Nobody has ever played e4, and this is the reason why. You can't just expand so recklessly in the center like that. But alright, if white doesn't do that, they obviously have a more serious option in mind. So let's go over, statistically, what is the least challenging of those options. D takes c5. Right, in this case, we play bishop takes c3. And after they recapture with the b-pawn, we have tripled white's pawns. And while the engine says that this is better for white, every single human would probably prefer black in this position, because white is going to have to spend most of their time either like rushing to catch up with development by giving away at least a few of these pawns, or is going to be greedy and try to hang on to these pawns at all costs. Right? But if white actually tries to hang on to all these pawns, it typically doesn't end out very well, because we get enormous compensation for our pawn, even if we're not able to win it back. Now do keep in mind, if white puts everything into trying to defend the c-pawns, yeah, we can't win them back. But the amount of compensation we'll have in return for gambiting our c-pawn to triple their pawns is so much more that we would actually straight up be better in that position. So, what if white actually is greedy, right? I mean, we start with queen a5, right? Attacking the c3 pawn, attacking the c5 pawn. The only way for white to defend both is to play queen d4, and our only move is to play knight f6. Otherwise, the g2 pawn hangs. Alright, what now? White can do a ton of things. They'll probably play knight f3. That's the most logical option. f3, e4, all these things could possibly be played. Anyway, after knight f3 is played, we can play knight c6, gaining a tempo on the queen. And, you know, if they try to defend even more, say with queen e3, the only way to really defend both of those pawns, then we can actually play a pretty counterintuitive, but still pretty nice move. We can play, well, after castles and, say, knight d2, trying to hang on to the pawn, we play b6. Right? This is a very counterintuitive move because we're untripling white's pawns. However, after they take, we take back and say, I don't know, maybe they like play g3, right? After we play like bishop a6 or something along those lines, white is going to have such a difficult time defending all these pawns and keeping the position playable. Their e-pawn is blocked by the queen. The king is still kind of a little far away from castling. The c-pawns are still perennially weak, which is absolutely not good because this, like, we could just shove a rook onto c8 and just attack these pawns. Black is better. Black is unquestionably better in these lines. White should really not try to hang on to all these pawns at the same time. It's just a bit too greedy. But alright, you know, maybe they don't have to be greedy. Maybe they could just play calmly, right? What if they just play a little more calmly? Well, in these cases, what we want to do is we want to play knight a6 and try to win the pawn back with the knight, while also just continuing our standard plans of, you know, playing knight f6, castling, b6, fiend counting the bishop, right? That's going to be our plan. For example, if white decides to, say, play knight f3 immediately, right? There's no rush to win back the pawn, play knight f6, and just stop b4, right? And also just play kind of calmly. Say they play queen c2, right? This is standard, typical move, preparing e4, which it does successfully do that. The reason why we don't take on c3 immediately is because after the bishop blocks, we have to like retreat the queen, right? And then e3 will come with tempo if we take another pawn, and it's just, you know, we don't have to be so greedy in this case. White's weaknesses are not so damaging to our position that we have to try and eliminate them immediately. So, if white plays something like queen c2, we play knight a6, and say they fiend counter the bishop. They could play e3 and just have the bishop stare into nothing forever, but most people probably won't do that. So after g3 played, we'll play knight takes c5, right? Winning back one of the pawns. Bishop g2 played. And after b6, fiend countering our own bishop, we're gonna have a pretty decent time. Say castle, bishop out, right? We're gonna castle soon. I don't really know exactly what white might do here. Maybe they'll play like bishop d2, bishop b2, trying to defend the c-pawn so they can free up the queen. And after we castle, it's very clear to see that black is not having too many problems here. It's a nice position, all things considered, right? And we got this because white is a bit too greedy in accepting the pawn immediately. Taking the c-pawn immediately triples the pawns, and we get enormous counterplay because we have a very obvious plan of attack. The rooks go into c-file, attacking the pawns, etc., etc. Alright, so that's one variation covered. After c5, they can play quite a few other things. Let's go over knight f3, right? Knight f3 is a move that can be played, you know, at multiple parts of the game. And while knight f6 totally works if you're into playing that variation of the Nimzo-Indian Defense, I think an easier system to play, and one that's pretty much equally as good, is to just take back, right? Take the d-pawn. Now, after the knight takes back the d-pawn, we play the very strange move, knight e7. Knight e7, right? You would never see this in the Nimzo-Indian Defense. But the idea is that we're reinforcing the knight on c3, when c6 when it gets there, preparing d4, and stopping any nonsense, right? Because your opponent has a dark bishop, they might pin your knight too, but on e7 it's just kind of impervious to any pin. So yeah, it's very strange, right? You never really see this in many other options. The one downside, of course, is that it does kind of allow e4, but it's not too bad. It's not too bad so far, right? After we castle, say your opponent plays bishop b2, just trying to develop very calmly. At this moment, we lash out in the center, right? After, say, I don't know, c takes d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5. We have completely opened up the center, but guess whose king is castled? Guess whose knight is still under pin? Guess whose knight is still kind of loose, while ours could just like easily go back? I wouldn't say black's winning this. It is white's move after all. But if anything, this looks pretty dang even to me. There's a lot of things that white could possibly have done earlier on, right? For example, if they don't go e4, just more solidly go e3, well, we can still break through with d5, and it actually gets even easier in that case. So, that's not really too much of a problem. So, let's cover e3. e3 is played to just defend the center. Now, we could play knight f6, we could also play f5, and just play a very positional game, right? Very closed-ish game. But if you want to transpose into something more open and liable for tactics, then what I recommend is you take the pawn. After they take back, you strike back in the center with d5. Right? Now, there's a lot of things white can do, to be completely honest, but the most common setup is just to go knight f3 immediately, and we will respond by playing knight f6. C takes d5 is very common, and taking back with the pawn is near immediate. Right? The reason why is because white can take back immediately with the pawn, and we don't really want to split off to two separate lines for this, so we just kind of get this isolated queen's pawn position for everybody. Bishop d3 will probably be played. Again, they can play, they can copy us actually and just go bishop here, which allows us to play our knight out, and we get a completely asymmetrical position. But most commonly, of course, they just kind of bring the bishop out. After we both castle, I recommend playing h6. h6 is so crucial because if you don't, the bishop is going to pin your knight, and this is going to be very annoying to try and defend the d-pawn. Right? And now, from here, white has a ton of things they can do. Like, knight e5 is pretty common for some reason, although I feel like that overextends because you could just kick it out immediately with the other knight. If something like h3 is played, right? White has a ton of ideas, but so does black. Right? Our positions are very symmetrical. Our idea is to go here with the knight, pin their knight if possible, but if not possible, then it's kind of whatever. Go rook e8, and start attacking the center that way. The IQP is good because it allows you to have a very active position, right? And this attack on the knight is still kind of annoying for white. If they were to ever play a3 and we transform the position into a hanging pawn's position. And that means that white has a pretty easily targetable weakness on the c-pawn. This is, of course, an even game. It's all symmetrical, more or less. But white and black still have a lot to fight for. And that's really what we're trying to get out of this opening. So, alright, that's e3. The next moves that they might exist are a3 and d5, right? If a3 is played, we have to take. And after they take back, we are going to actually transpose into the Nimzo-Indian defense with knight f6. Now this looks a bit strange, I guess. White's pawn structure is kind of strong in the center, and they're probably going to be able to launch a big mass of pawns, but on the other hand, our c-pawn is actually doing a pretty nice job of keeping everything together. If they ever decide to take our c-pawn, then they have tripled their pawns, and, well, we can see that white is not going to have a fun time in that position. Right? After knight f6 is played, there are two things that white can do here. They can play f3 and try to launch a giant mass of pawns in the center, although quite recklessly, or they could play e3 and just play more calmly, right? If they decide to play more calmly, say e3 immediately, then we'll play d6. d6 is going to be played because we want to lock down the center. They have, 2 bishops, we have 1 bishop. Of course we want to lock down the center. But more importantly, it means that white can't just run the e-pawn down the board and then just try to dislodge a knight or anything like that. By keeping the position locked, white's pawn majority in the center isn't really going to be felt, especially since the majority consists of this doubled c-pawn. So, from here, the position can branch out into a ton of different ways, and it's kind of impossible to really cover everything, but bishop d3 is more or less the most common move, and we'll play knight c6 as a result. If they play d5, trying to expand in the center, that isn't very good because it gives our knight a very nice square on e5, which attacks the bishop, attacks the c-pawn, and things can get kind of ugly there for white pretty dang fast. So alright, knight c6 played. They'll play knight e2. That is the whole idea. Of course, they don't really want to go knight f3 because they need the f-pawn. So, that's the idea. e5. Right, the idea is we strike back immediately in the center. If they decide to go d5, then we can reroute our knight over to a5, fianchetto the bishop, and put tremendous pressure on c-pawn. Basically, we have a pretty obvious plan of attack if they go d5. So most of them don't go d5, they kind of just keep the tension, because this e-pawn isn't really too threatening. If they take, of course, then, our knight has an even better square, and they isolate their c-pawns. So, yeah. e4 is going to play. And say both players castle, right? It's the most natural move in this position. e4, right? Because now they can actually play it. h6, because this pin on the knight would be very, very annoying, and having to weaken our structure like this is just, it's just asking for not really anything good. So, alright, at this moment, white has probably felt the pressure on the center caving in, so they'll probably play d5, right? And in this position, we play knight e7, after playing f3, trying to defend the center, knight g6, and we're basically in the King's Indian Defense type positions. Our main plan should be to reroute the knight over to the f-square, right? Provoking g3, which would at least give us something to target, especially with the light square bishop having a very nice home on h6 if that ever happens. And just in general, there's a lot of things that can happen here, right? If they don't, if they kind of just shuffle back and forth, our eventual plan is to actually break through with f5, right? Opening up the center or the flank of the king side, so we can just get all of our pieces here. And while white's bishop kind of sucks, and knight isn't really doing very much, this rook isn't doing very much either, we can at least try to take advantage of this. And ultimately, even though white has a pretty nice center, they can't, the traditional King's Indian Defense plan for white is that they break through on the queen side, right? But there is not really a good way for white to expand on the queen side here. The a-pawn is really all they have, and though it can get dangerous, they kind of have to march it up the board, and then it kind of just dies, because we have our own a-pawn, so we can kind of either stop it in its tracks, or just wait. Of course, you could also just shuffle the knights back and forth, or just wait for white to run out of improving moves, but this more active way to play is pretty much better. Now, of course, if they ever went f4, that's a free pawn, right? You would take it with the e-pawn. Once they take back, then we can just sink our knight into e5. So f4 is not really an option here. Ultimately, in these a3 lines, we kind of get a very nice King's Indian type game. But even better, because white's counterplay is not in the King's Indian fashion. So alright. But let's say, of course, after they take, play knight f6, they play f3. Right? And the plan is obvious. They're planning to shove the e-pawn down the center. Right? So, what's the plan here? The plan is actually quite similar. f3 is going to be played, and we play d6 anyway, because we want to close down the center. e4 is going to be played. That's the whole point of playing f3. Knight c6, of course, just continuing as usual. Bishop e3 probably played, and b6. The whole plan here is, of course, we're going to fiend kettle our bishop, but if not, at least the b pawn supports the c pawn and gives a very nice structure here. Right? Alright. So, after, say, bishop e3, bishop e3 might be played, for example, and, you know, they can realistically develop the bishops however they so wish. Knight's probably coming out to e2, of course. We'll play knight a5, right? And the same plan from before. We are going to put enormous pressure on the c-pawn, which is going to be actually quite annoying for white to defend, because they can't exactly defend it with the queen now, can they? So, yeah. Okay. Continuing on, they'll play knight e2, of course, because that is congruous with their setup. Bishop a6, because, you know, that's our plan. That's just our plan. They'll castle. They don't really have very much better to do. We'll play queen c7. We could, of course, take the pawn immediately, but there isn't really a need to eliminate that specific weakness. And the doubled c-pawns kind of help white. Kind of help us. So, there's not really a need to go for that. f4, of course, is played, trying to gain complete control of the center. And e5 looks more like a threat than ever before. How do we respond? We do the crazy thing, and we long castle. We long castle, right? Because white is launching a pawn storm on the king side, and they have no real attack on the queen side. So, I mean, like, they can't even move the a-pawn, the knight is blockading. So that's the plan, right? We have more pieces, we have more forces on the queen side. Let's long castle, which is crazy, right? f5, trying to break through on the queen side, right? Now we start taking out the weakness, right? Bishop takes c4. They could, of course, take, and after we take back, their bishop is threatened, and their whole plan is kind of falling apart. It's not really what they want, so they probably won't do that. F takes e6, trying to clear up the tension in the center. Okay, well, given a chance, let's play bishop b3, right? Attacking the queen. Bishop c2 will probably be played. And after an exchange of bishops, recapture the pawn. Bishop g5 will probably be played, pinning the knight down to the rook. e5, right? And in this position, it's very clear what our plans are. We have castled on opposite sides, but white doesn't really have the capability to open the center to their benefit in this case, right? We have most of our pieces here, and though we have some light squared weaknesses, white doesn't really have a light squared bishop anymore, so that's not really a problem. The plan here is that after you long castle, you're going to launch a big attack on the king side. And yeah, we just struck back in the center, and what does the engine think? Yeah, black is slightly better. So in that case, right, even though black is slightly better, this is still not an easy position to win exactly, because white always has counterplay. But ultimately, we also have very nice counterplay, right? The rooks are coming to open files. These pawns are going to get going real fast because the bishop is here and there's tempo on the bishop. These pawns aren't particularly strong. Meanwhile, we have a really nice pawn chain on the dark squares. So, there's a lot to work with. And that's a3. Okay. Last move in the knight c3 lines that we're going to go over is d5, right? After this move, there are quite a few options to go for, but the most critical one, of course, is just to go knight f6, right? And this kind of reminds me of a Benoni defense, except in this case, white isn't really doing better because our bishop's doing pretty well, honestly. We don't have to spend time fianchettoing it and trying to stop e4. We already stopped e4 because the knight isn't really supporting e4 anyway. So alright, what goes on here? There's a lot of moves actually. However, one move specifically that I see a lot, right? Other than f3, f3 is kind of played quite a bit. But the other move we see a lot is bishop g5, trying to pin down the knight. Does this work? Not really. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not like white is worse than anything, but this is very clearly not what white should be doing. They should focus more on developing their king side for a castle, unless they want to castle queenside, which is just kind of suicidal, it looks like. So I would argue this is not what white should be doing. In any case, we play d6. Right? We're just stopping the pawn from marching down, and we're just creating a nice support for the c-pawn. If they ever take, of course, we take back with either the bishop or the f-pawn. It doesn't really matter too much there. Sometimes taking with the bishop is probably better because you can attack the c-pawn, but that's not really too much of a deal. So what now? What we do now is anticipate that they'll probably play e4, right? Because that's why they pinned our knight. There isn't really another reason besides wanting to get in e4 so badly that they're willing to do it. So here, we remove a defender of the e-pawn because they have so brazenly just tried to do it. Right? After they take back, we'll play h6. Right? Obviously, we're kicking out the bishop. Now, if the bishop actually goes back, right? This is not good because after g5, bishop here, we take the pawn, right? Let's say they play queen c2, just trying to defend it. We snipe the bishop after taking back with the pawn. Our plan is to keep the king in the center or castle queenside, and just exploit the fact that white is no longer up the bishop pair and has lost a pawn. Right? It's not like white is losing here or anything, but it's very clear that something has not gone right in the opening for them. So alright, after that, they're probably going to take, all things considered. So, yeah, we go here. Bringing the queen out. Queen d2, I guess. There's a lot of things white can play here, honestly. Queen d2, queen c2, rook b1. And it's more important to understand the key ideas here, right? Say queen d2 is played, right? The key ideas here are that we can castle kingside. We're going to probably attack the c-pawn again, right? Use the knight to also jump into the position. Probably trade off in the future if the c-pawn is eliminated. And ultimately exploit white's lack of development to go for a very nice attack. So right, that's the bishop g5 line. Right, it's sometimes played, but honestly I don't think it's very good. f3 is the other common move, trying to launch a massive pawn mass in the center. We do the same thing, right, d6. And they're going to play e4, which is the whole point of playing f3. Right? Note that white always wants to get in e4 if possible. Now we're going to do something very crazy. Right? This is a very crazy line. I don't think anyone has ever played it. Oh, some people have played it actually, but it's quite uncommon. I'm recommending we go b5. Right? White has not forced us to double their c-pawns yet. Therefore, if we can distract the c-pawn, then suddenly the center is going to be open to our favor because our king is going to be castled before theirs. And they have opened up their king by playing f3. So right, the brazen strike, b5. So what happens, right? What happens if they brazenly take our pawn? We take back, they take back, we castle, right? We could also play this in the Benko Gambit style if we wanted to. After this check, kind of gets annoying, right? There's a lot of different moves that white can play here, but ultimately, they should not be opening up the center like that when their king has not yet castled. It's just not the best idea. It's alright, they're probably not going to take the pawn, right? But what will they do? They'll probably keep the tension, right? They can't really defend it with the b-pawn, because that would hang the knight with check, and we would pick up the exchange as well. So, they wouldn't really use b3 to try and defend the pawn. They'll probably play something like knight e2, right? Just calmly developing. I mean, most of them seem to do that. So, I mean, we're going to execute our plan. We're going to take the c-pawn, right? At this point, white has a lot of things that they can possibly do. They really do. They could play a3 or knight f4, or something along those lines. The most common, of course, is knight f4, so let's look at it. Knight f4, right? At this point, we want to go e5, and just shove the knight out of the center. Knight back to e2, because they're arguing that tension in the center benefits us, so by getting rid of it, it benefits them. In a way, knight b to d7 played, and knight g3, rerouting the knight and opening up the bishop's attack on the pawn. What's our plan here? We're going to play knight b6, defending the pawn, right? Making it annoying for white to try and win this stuff back. Alright, but what now, right? Bishop b2 played, right? Just preparing to castle, right? You should probably castle, given a chance. So, here, we're gonna play knight g8. Right? This looks very strange. There isn't really a reason, quote-unquote, for us to do that, right? Wrong. Because, actually, this is part of a maneuver to actually get the knight onto f4. Right? Here on f6, if you look at it, like, where is our knight going? It has no forward mobility whatsoever. The f-pawn is completely restricting it. So here, right, our plan is to bring it back to g8, go to e2, go to g6, and final g7. No, g6, and finally shove it back into the outpost. That is, created because this knight is blocking the g-pawn, right? It's a very long-term maneuver, but since the center is so completely locked, we have the possibility of doing this. While white is not really going to have very much to do in the meantime. They'll probably castle, of course, and knight e7 is going to be played, which is our whole idea. And, I don't know, let's say f4 is played, right? He takes f4, in this case. The bishop is going to take back. And if white doesn't go for such a brazen strike with f4, then, they don't really have to, but they would completely leave us open to execute our plan. There aren't really that many pawn breaks for white if they don't go for this, so we're just left with this kind of position. Takes, of course, knight g6 gaining a tempo on the bishop, right? Now, white could completely surrender the bishop if they wanted to, but we could also just castle and not really deal with that. So, most white players prefer to not really do that. So instead, they'll probably play like bishop d2, just retreating the bishop, for example. And then, knight e5, and voila, we have a really nice knight just kind of sunk in the center. And what can we say? I think white is doing pretty well here. Even if they weren't to go for this, we would still have a nice outpost for the knight, courtesy the e-pawn, right here, right? And after we castle and do everything, I'd say white has a pretty nice position. So, yeah, that's knight c3, all covered up. So, after covering knight c3, let's take a look at its cousin, blocking the check with knight d2. Now, this specific opening is actually quite tricky, right? Most of us look at this and we think, oh, that's so passive, it blocks the bishop, it blocks the queen, right? But what it really does is make sure that when a3 is played, we can't double the c-pawns, and in exchange, white gets a little development with their queen. And that's why this is statistically the most dangerous opening against black. However, it's still workable, and actually, I find out that at least in the opening, it's not really the problem. It's not really the problem. But, it's our move. What do we do? Right? Well, you could play knight f6 and go for a weird version of the Bogo-Indian defense. But the more independent line again is just strike the center with c5. Right? And white has a ton of moves here. They can play e3, or knight f3, or a3. Taking the pawn, advancing the pawn, and the like. There's a lot of things they can possibly do. Let's refute e4 again, right? Just for the sake of it. Right? e4 again, they're expanding too brazenly in the center. Right? So after we play c takes d4. Right? Knight f3 to try and win back the pawn. Knight c6, denying them the ability to win that pawn. Bishop d3, just giving up. e5, which is supported by our knight. Castles. Honestly, d6, but also knight f6 also works. a3 played, and we'll just return for bishop. b4. Maybe just trying to expand, and d6 is played. Right? And ultimately, white is going to have a very hard time winning back the pawn on this line. And what have they gotten in return? I mean, some queenside space, I guess, but it's quite fragile. We could just strike with a5, and I mean, if b5 ever comes, our knight is going to have a pretty nice square here, attacking the c-pawn again. So, yeah, ultimately this is a kind of a disaster for white. It's not good for them. Even if it does mean that they win one of their pawns back, this is just not good. It's just not good. Black's pawn chain is quite strong. It's alright. It's pretty rare that anyone plays e4 even, because it just outright hangs the d pawn, with no clear way to win it back anyway. But alright, after we play c5, there's still quite a few of good options that white can possibly do here. They can play d5, right? But this line is just kind of inferior to the knight c3 version of it, because at least in the knight c3 version, it kind of forces us to take the knight, but in this case, the knight blocks the vision of the queen, and more importantly, this pawn is just kind of weak. It's just kind of weak, because the knight is not supporting it. But alright, this is still a fine line for white, I guess. It doesn't really give anything more than equality, but there's nothing wrong with it. Right, so obviously after a trade in the center, let's play knight f6. Right, note that if they ever advance the pawn, it frees up our knight to go to c6, and we could just quickly pick it off with our other pieces. Right, quite frankly, like, just shoving the d pawn down the board this early on in the match is generally not the best idea. So after taking back, we play knight f6. What did they do? I mean, they could wait, but more likely they're going to play a3. Right, they're going to play a3. And surprisingly, we go back with the bishop. Right, we don't take their knight. We don't have to take their knight in this case. The pin is so annoying. And they can't really expand with b4 to try and kick out our bishop, because that just kind of hangs a pawn. The c pawn is protecting it. So alright, what will they do? They'll probably get started with development. Knight f3 probably played. And after we castle to get our king out of the center, they'll probably play something like queen b3. Queen b3, trying to defend the pawn because this knight pin is getting old for them, right? In this case, we play rook e8. The reason why we play rook e8, this is pretty important, is because if they for some reason ever manage to smoke our bishop out, right, we need to have an iron grip over e4. There needs to be no way for white to support this pawn with another pawn, because if they ever do that, we are actually going to have a problem where they have a massive space advantage and there isn't very much we have as compensation. I mean, actually, we would have quite a bit as compensation, but we do not have to allow it, so why would we? In this case, e3 is probably played, because otherwise e4 is just not possible. d6, of course, because we want to finally lend some support to the c-pawn, but this also opens up our knight and our bishop, which is very nice. What does white do here? Honestly, quite a few things that they could possibly do, but they're probably going to try and castle. So bishop b2 will probably be played, and from here, we'll play a6, right? This is a classic Benoni plan, trying to expand on the queen side. Now, it's going to be hard for someone to play a4 in this case. It's a good move, of course, but it makes sure that the bishop is pretty much immortal on this diagonal, and also, like, you're moving the pawn twice. You're moving a corner pawn twice in the opening, trying to stop something, while we can just play here and then just try to shove a piece on b2 anyway. So I don't really see what the major plan with that is. Oh, b6 I guess in this case, but still, there's that. So a5, it's a fair move I guess, but it really shouldn't be too bad in this case. After a6 is played, they'll probably castle, which is the whole plan. And after b5, we have a very clear plan if they advance the pawn. Right? After the d5 move, we are going to fianchetto out the bishop, attack this pawn, move the knight here, possibly here, but, you know, a couple of various places. Just attack this pawn mercilessly. We have such an obvious weakness of attack, we have very nice queenside space, and we have an iron control over e4. So d5 is not the way for white to go. It really isn't. Alright, so what else can white play, right? How about d takes, right? It's a little more serious here because we can't exactly triple up the pawns immediately. But again, it does kind of not really work as well as white would like it to. So right, what do we do now? Knight f6, typically, of course, we're stopping e4. Just as usual. Now, a3 will probably be played. And in this case, I mean, like, I guess you could take the knight, but it's not very good. Just take the pawn, right? And the most common move is to just keep expanding with b4. Now, interestingly enough, you could take f7, right? You could play bishop takes f7, king here, knight check, king back, queen f6, and, you know, the line keeps going on and on. But ultimately, this leads to a forced draw. This leads to a forced draw, which is very interesting for quite a few reasons. But I am not happy literally just forcing a draw 18 moves later in the opening, right? So we are going to play what looks to be a little more passive, but is going to be a lot more confrontational in the future. We're going to play bishop b7. Okay? So that's the plan. Now, there's quite a bit of things that they can do. But let's keep it simple and say that they're trying to develop. Most people see that this diagonal is open from expanding on the queen side, so they'll flank out their dark square bishop. That is, of course, by far the most common move. But we can't waste any time. Just like, you know, I mean, we could castle, I guess, that's fine. But we gotta be confrontational. We gotta play a5 and strike back on the queen side while it's possible. Right? Putting immense pressure. If they ignore it, of course, we have the bishop attacking the pawn, so they're gonna lose a pawn. So they have to respond to this in some way. If they take, their entire queen side is shattered, their pawn structure sucks, and they also just lost a pawn. So they won't do that. The most common move by far is to advance the pawn. That is just the most logical move by far. Okay, well, we don't exactly want the pawn marching all the way down. I mean, it's actually fine if they march it down even further, but we don't want to bury our bishop, so we play b6, right? We have a nice target, right? c4 is kind of weak, and we have a very clear plan to attack here. So, alright, what does white do in this case? Honestly, there's a lot of things that white can do here. Quite a bit. Let's say that they start flanking out the bishop, right? Well, we can't really let them do that. We have to rush to the diagonal. And here, right, they have to play knight f3. Knight f3, because everything else makes sure that they don't lose a bunch of things in the corner. Right? So, what do we do now? Queen c2. Queen c7. This protects the bishop, right? So in case there's any like freak tactics by moving the knight and unleashing discovered attack, which also threatens the rook in the corner, none of that will happen because our bishop is defended. But also in addition, it pressures a very weak pawn in black's position, and white's position. So that's the plan. Bishop g2, of course, continuing on, we both castle. And we'll play d6 here, right? Gaining a firm control over c5. There's no way white could possibly push the pawn down now, because if they ever do, they're just going to lose the pawn outright. Okay, most of them will probably play queen c2, right? a4 can also be played, but I don't really see the point in that. It just kind of loses the tempo. We don't really intend to march the pawn forward in most circumstances. That's not really a plan. They'll play queen c2, of course, defending their pawn. Right? Not a big deal. What do we do now? Rook c8, right? Okay, so many of you are probably looking at knight d7 and being like, that's such a nice move, right? We could get the knight to the outpost. That's so nice. Why aren't we doing that as soon as possible? Number one, we would play rook c8 anyway, so don't really be too afraid. But the other problem is that if we actually do this immediately, white can actually play like this. They can play knight e5, right? And, you know, I mean, we would probably trade off the light square bishops, and that's probably a light benefit to us. But the main problem is that they sink the knight into here. They sink the knight into c6, which is a major problem because it's just lording over our position. And we need the knight on b8 to stop that, right? Or we could just nip it in the bud immediately. But right now, rook c8 is more than a serviceable move. What is rook gonna do? I don't know, rook c1, maybe. Right? Honestly, there's a lot of things white can do possibly here. We go e5, right? Our plan is to, of course, take some very nice space in the center, and it's supported by our d-pawn, so it's very nice. And sure, there are some weaknesses, but I'm not really sure how white is going to exploit this weakness, especially with our pieces covering it so very nicely. Alright, what does it do? Rook ft1, I guess. To be honest, I'm making up moves for white here. There's a lot of things they can possibly do. But, again, now we play knight e7. Knight b to d7, right? In this case, our plan is very simple. right? If at any point, we can of course sink the knight in there and just have a pretty nice dominant knight over the position. But our main plan, of course, is to attack this over the long term. Maybe get a reasonable trade going on, but this is our position to work with. We have nice space, and I would say black's about equal in this position. So d takes c5 and immediately going for a3 is, no, it's a good idea, I guess, if white wants a good position, but it's not going to give us a bad position either. Alright, so after they take, they don't have to go for some aggressive queenside expansion already. But what if they just play calmly, right? I mean, we'll play knight f6, and I'll play knight f3, right? Just playing calmly, not really trying to go for the throat. In this position, white has so many things they can do. It's honestly kind of difficult to find out a universal plan that works against all of them, but we kind of do have one. In this case, knight f3 is played. Well, I don't really see a reason to let them even try to queenside expand. a5 is going to be played, because we want to stop any chance of them doing any nonsense on the queenside. So, well, now e3. Right, they can also fiend counter the bishop, that's fine too. But fiend countering the bishop doesn't really make as much sense here, because we can immediately just clog the diagonal with the knight and just get the rook out of the way. It's not really too big of a deal. So e3 will probably be played here. So, what do they do now? We castle, as per usual. Bishop e2, probably played to continue on their plan. Bishop takes e5. Right? We don't need to be provoked in this case. They probably won't do it because we have the a-pawn. So, they'll probably castle as well. b6, finally, right? Just solidifying our bishop. Now, of course, we would have to rush a little more with b6 if they actually tried fianchettoing. But in this case, if they don't try to fianchetto, we just go with this kind of setup. b6, b3, right? They have to get the dark square bishop out somehow. And they can't exactly go b4. So they go b3. Bishop b7, bishop b2. And we strike back with d5. Right? We want our space as well. And this kind of fights against the queenside expansion. Whose position is more equipped for the board to open up? I'd say it's kind of even. Could go either way, to be honest. So right, after d5 is played, c captures, knight captures, and h3, right? It honestly is kind of difficult for white to make a very satisfactory move here, and h3 just kind of, it's a nice move to make if necessary. But in this case, we have a nice position, right? We can move our knight here or here, and then just get it closer to the center. We have the D and C files to work with, so we can just put our rooks on very open squares. And again, this is pretty nice, pretty balanced white and black. So nothing too bad here for either side. So right, that covers d takes. That covers d takes. What else can they do? Well, they can go e3. They can go e3. Right, but in this case, c takes d4 and d takes are very clearly the best moves. Right, we'll play knight f6, stopping. Well, e4 isn't even possible now, but we're supporting a d5 break later in the future. Knight f3 will probably be played, and we will castle. Bishop d3 will probably be played. They can also play bishop e2, which is slightly more passive and not quite as good. And we will play b6, right, with the aim of fianchettoing our bishop. They'll castle, and we will continue our plan with fianchettoing the bishop. a3 will be played at some point, if not now, but in this case we don't really need to take the knight, so we'll just drop the bishop all the way back. b4 will probably be played, trying to expand on the queen side, and as usual we strike back with a5. There isn't really a need for white to try and take the pawn. I mean, if they do take, this just kind of shatters the entire structure. It looks not good. So they won't. They'll probably advance the pawn. Right? And we have a very similar position to what we've seen before. d5. Right? We're striking back in the center. And now white's entire queenside pawn chain is kind of falling apart. There is so much under attack that it's kind of difficult to hold everything together. Bishop b2, fianchettoing the bishop. D takes c4. And after the knight takes, right, we are left with giving white an isolated queen's pawn, but not a particularly good version of it, because we have pretty firm control of the square in front of it. If they take, of course, with the bishop instead of the knight, it's not good, because the bishop just kind of stares into nothing forever. It's no good. Most people take back with the knight anyway. So, we continue with our plan of knight b to d7, and our plan in the future is to target the weakness and attack it. This weakness is particularly bad because it's hemming in the fianchettoed bishop. So after we go put the knight in front, we can rotate the other knight in, put the rooks on the open D and C files, and we have a nice game going on in the future. Alright, that's why e3 isn't quite as good. It kind of leaves white and black way too evenly matched for most people's tastes. Alright, how about knight f3? Right? The immediate knight f3. Just trying to challenge white by defending. Well, okay. We take and we take back. Right? And we go knight c6. There are way too many things that white can possibly do here. Way too many. They can taking the knight is actually really bad because we take back with the b pawn and break through in the center, or we can take back with the d pawn and just have a really nice solid position. That's not very dangerous. Right? They can go knight to c2, although that's not very good. They just shoved the pawn all the way, shoved the knight all the way back. We just retreat with the bishop. That's not a big deal. So at this point, this is gonna be a made-up line for the most part, but it has happened once, right? Knight back to f3, which has happened once. It's not very common. In this case, we play knight f6, right? Just getting our pieces out. And in this case, it's kind of strange. Black has a development advantage to white in this case. And if not, then at least white would concede something else. The knight would perennially be hanging. If e3 were ever to be played, we would just transpose into the e3 line. So that's not particularly good for white. In this case, what do we do? What do we do? Well, there's a lot of things that white can also do, but let's say they play a3 earlier, right? In this case, you can also retreat the bishop, I guess. It's not really such a big deal. But the reason you don't want to retreat the bishop here is because once b4 comes, b5 is a legitimate threat, right? That's the main key thing of deciding whether or not you want to actually retreat or trade your bishop off. Whether or not b5 would actually be a threat. If there's no knight on c3, there's like nothing to worry about. You would just play b6 and just fianchetto the bishop. Not a big deal. But in this case, since b5 would come with tempo and be kind of dangerous as a result, we have to take. We have to take the knight. Now, most people are going to take with the queen. But you can also take with the bishop. Either one's fine. They don't really change our plan all too much. So, say they take with the bishop, right? I mean, you could expand, I guess. But, you know, most people prefer to do things with the lowest value piece. So let's say they try to do that. Right? Well, in this case, we can castle. So let's do that. e3 will probably be played. e4 cannot, of course, be played, but they want to develop their bishop out. Right? g3 can also be played. That's fine. In this case, e3, we strike back with d5. Right? Whether or not they went for g3, we just strike back with d5. After c takes, we actually take back with the queen. Right? Because interestingly, in these lines, the knight not being on c3 means that the queen is actually free to capture on d5. So, after bishop e2, just calmly developing, we play rook d8, just adding more pressure on the center, and also just getting our pieces active. They'll castle. We'll play e5, right? Opening up our light square bishop. And bishop c3 may follow. Honestly, there's too many things we could possibly do here. It's not recommended that you trade the queens because it just gets white more active. So, in the meantime, let's just keep it simple with knight e4. Right? Of course, the plan is simple, right? You move the bishop here, we'll attack with the knight. But if white didn't play something like that, you would just develop the bishop, bring the other rook to the c file, and other things like that. Now, knight f3 lines are very open-ended. White can do pretty much anything in these lines, but your plan is pretty much always going to be to develop out the knights, to break open the center, and try to activate all your pieces. Alright, so that's knight f3. So now we'll go for the final options, right? a3. What if a3 is played, right? Obviously, in this case, we have to take the knight. This is not really an option for anyone to really ignore. So, after they take back with the queen, if they take back with the bishop, let's just show that. If they take back with the bishop, after c takes d4, it becomes profoundly annoying to try and win this pawn back. Right after knight f3, we have knight c6 and just that and that. It's so annoying to try to win the pawn back that most people really don't go for it. So most people play queen takes, right? And in this case, we're gonna take the pawn, right? Because we want to pretty much like blow off the center. White has two moves here: queen takes and knight f3, trying to take back with the knight. Let's say they take back with the queen, right? Now the g2 pawn is under attack, and we don't really want the rook trapped in the corner. So we're gonna play knight f6. We're gonna play knight f6, right? Just calmly developing. Okay, they'll probably play knight f3, more or less. We'll play knight c6, finally able to gain our tempo on the queen, right? There are so many squares the queen can go to. c2, d2, h4. If it ever goes to like queen c2, for example, our plan is to break through with d5 immediately, right? After that, once he takes knight here, like we get, okay, you wouldn't take back with the knight because that would be a problem, but you would take back, say, with the queen, and there's not really too many problems with white's position, and not too many with black's position either. It's very evenly matched. I'd say black has a little bit of a nicer position, but it's not too big of a deal, right? Same thing if it goes back, if the queen goes back to d1, right? We still want to break through with d5. But alright, our trickiest option is actually if they go back to the side of the board, right? If they ever do go back to the side of the board, what we want to do instead is to play knight e7, right? Clogging the diagonal, and more importantly, aiming to get our pieces on the king side where they can earn even more tempos on the queen, right? Very nice. We can still fink out the bishop later on in the match. For now, this is going to be our plan. After knight e7, of course, bishop g5. It's probably going to be played. Knight g6, of course, attacking the queen. Queen goes to d4. I don't know, there's a ton of places the knight could possibly go to. Interestingly enough, you could actually try to repeat moves by going back and forth, but, you know, we're not going to do that. Okay, so after queen d4, we're going to play h6, obviously, and try to just deal with that. Of course, if the bishop goes back, we can use the knight to snipe off the bishop, and that's pretty cool, right? So most people decide to take. And after we take back, most people choose to take back, actually. Well, alright then. Gonna have to take back. Queen takes f6. Not everyone's gonna take, but if they do, then it's not too bad. For anybody, this is a roughly even game, and if white ever decides to castle kingside, we have an open g file to try and attack. That's not a big deal. Yeah, the double pawns look ugly, but at the same time, like, without queens on the board, there isn't really a way to exploit them. Alright, say rook d1 is played. Right, just keeping things calm. Well, we'll play b6, right? And we'll get our same exact setup as before. So a3, followed by queen takes d4. It's not too challenging, for the most part. Right, you just rotate your knights over and exploit the weakness of the queen. In this case, white is making multiple moves with the queen in the opening. So at least there is at least something to work with there. It's not very popular though. Alright, a more challenging move is knight f3. Trying to win back the pawn with the knight. Right? In this case, this pawn is dead. It's dead meat. There's no way to really save it. So why even bother? Play knight f6 instead. So the knight is going to take the pawn. Most of the time anyway. If they take back with the queen, it kind of defeats the purpose of knight f3 immediately. So there's that. No take. We castle, of course. g3 will probably be played. e3 is not good because the bishop stares into the pawn. That's not very ideal. So g3 will be played. And Well, as you can see, if we don't do anything, our position's going to be pretty bad. So what do? Strike back with d5. Strike back immediately, actually. And after the take back, we are going to take back with the queen, right? Because the queen now is attacking the rook in the corner. Okay. What did they do? Knight f3, naturally. And we continue developing with knight c6. Note, of course, if they ever take our queen, we could take back with the knight and have a more active knight. So that's not really something to worry about. 6, of course, they continue with their plan, bishop g2. And this does pose a little bit of a problem because there might be some discovered attacks looming in the future. Right now, it's not possible because the bishop is currently undefended. But we will have to look out for that. Rook d8 played, right? Just trying to get more active. White is going to castle. And here, we're going to play queen c4. Right? It's a critical move to know in many positions, but in this specific case, that's kind of true. Queen c4 will be played. And what does it do, right? It attacks the queen, but also it attacks the e-pawn, which means that the queen has to defend the e-pawn. And they can only really do that from here, or here, I guess. That's also an option. Or, of course, they could also hang the e-pawn and try to get compensation. But if they ever hang the e-pawn, and the reason they do it is because otherwise their queen would be buried, we would still have a pretty nice game in that case. We would be under a little bit of fire, but as you can see, most of their fire is pointed towards the queen side. So, no. Not the worst ever trade for that. In any case, let's say the queen actually does try to defend. So they go to queen e1, right? It's about time we go for a5, right? We need to open up our bishop and claim some space in the center. So we'll do it with e5. Bishop g5 probably played. And in this case, we're probably going to have to accept double pawns. You can also play a6, h6 if you're really annoyed with this specific possibility. And that's fine too, I guess. But this is more ambitious and it still works. So here, bishop g5. And after that, we'll go bishop e6. Right? Just calmly developing. If they take, and we take back, we're going to have a pretty decent position, all things considered. They're like, don't get me wrong, our pawns are not the best looking ever, but if you take a look at white's rook, white's queen, white's rook, compared to our rooks, I'd say it's fair compensation, right? We have very dynamic play, and white's going to have to spend some time getting their pieces out. Of course, if you don't want to go for that, you can always just play h6 immediately and just have a pretty decent position. Alright, that is knight d2 complete. Alright, so the last line we have to go over in this specific defense is blocking with the bishop. This is considered the main line nowadays because blocking with the d2 knight seems a bit passive for most people, and knight c3 statistically just hasn't had as great of success as this. So in this case, unlike the other variations, we probably shouldn't go c5. If we go c5 and then white takes our bishop, we then have to capture back with the c-pawn, which diverts our pressure away from the center. So from that logic, we could defend the bishop with something like queen e7. We could take, or we could actually just retreat. There's a lot of different options for black here. But the one that I find most interesting is a5, defending the bishop from the flank. And this basically poses the question back to white, because if they don't do anything, our bishop is still pinning their bishop, making it a little bit awkward for them to try and develop. If they try to force the issue immediately with a3, then they actually do have quite a bit to work with. And if they don't force the issue immediately, there are still a lot of other lines to deal with. So aside from a3, they could play knight c3, knight f3, e3, g3, bishop takes bishop, and etc., etc. In fact, in this case, they can even play e4, and it's not even the worst ever. We will go over that later. So alright, that's the key idea behind a5, supporting it from the flank and just trying to keep the tension. What if white folds? What if they take our bishop? Obviously, we should take back with the pawn. And here, white has two major branches of what they can do. They can try to attack this pawn immediately and try to win it back, or they can just ignore it and just develop normally with things like e3 and knight f3. What if they play queen b3, trying to win the pawn back immediately? Well, in this case, we have a very strong move, and that is c5, striking back in the center immediately. And in this case, most people take the pawn, right? Because that pawn's not really defended. However, that gives us this, knight a6, allowing us to keep defending the pawn and to attack their weak c-pawn. A very nice move. Now, of course, in this case, white can't really capture the a-pawn. I guess they can, but they don't want to lose the queen. So most people just kind of give up here, and then just play something like knight f3. Just calmly developing as per usual. Well, in this case, we're going to keep going after the pawn with queen e7. And in this case, what we're actually threatening is that if we take the pawn, and white is like, oh, the knight no longer defends the b-pawn, they take back, we have a discovered check to win the queen. And that is pretty nasty. So obviously, no one is realistically going to fall for that. What they'll probably do in the meantime is just play like e3. Of course, if they play e4, then the knight taking here actually comes with even more force, because we're also targeting the e-pawn. But that's still completely possible. In any case, we're playing knight takes c5. And this is attacking the queen. Now, of course, again, if the queen were to take, the queen is lost from a discovered attack. Okay, where did it go? c2 sounds like a pretty good square, preparing e4. What do we do now? Well, we could play knight f6. That's totally fine. Ugh, can't draw arrows. Yeah, we could play knight f6. That's totally fine. But I think one of our pieces is feeling a little hemmed in by the pawns. So, one of the better moves is to play b6 immediately and try to fiend KO the bishop. And after white plays something like bishop b2 with the bishop staring into the pawn, we fiend KO the bishop. Castle, knight f6, knight b to d2, castle, and black doesn't really have too many problems here. White's bishop isn't really doing all too much here, and their knights are fine, I guess, but white has also made several moves in the opening with just the queen, so probably black is about even here, maybe slightly better. Okay, so that covers one variation. Now obviously, right, they don't have to go for the throat immediately and try to win the pawn. What if they just kind of ignore it? What if they just play something like, I don't know, knight f3, right? Well, in this case, we'll play knight f6, just developing. They'll play e3, of course also developing. And a little bit of a key idea, b6, right? We played this in the other line, but here it's actually even more potent, because not only are we fiend KOing the bishop, we're also threatening a hyper fiend KO, we can also push c5, which is now supported by the b-pawn. And that is pretty key. Okay, but in the meantime, bishop d3 played. Trying to continue development, we fiend KO our bishop. Knight b to d2 played. Castle, castle. And we finally strike with c5, attacking the center, right? No, you don't really want to go c5 before you fully finish up your kingside development, because if you do, bad things might happen, like your opponent trying to open up the center by marching down their pawns, and it just kind of gets ugly fast. So you should probably castle before you do anything of that sort. In the meantime, white, of course, has to continue developing. There's a lot of moves they can play here. Let's say they play queen c2. Doesn't really matter too much. We'll play d6, further supporting the c-pawn, and carving out a little square for our knight. Also stopping, of course, like a really brazen pawn advancement. Okay, say rook f to e1. Sorry, not rook f. Rook f to e1. Further preparing e4. We're not really in the mood to try and stop them, so play knight b to d7. e4 played, and we play c takes d4. At long last, right? When the e-pawn no longer defends the d-pawn, we can finally take. And yes, while this does split our structure and make it look, honestly, not too beautiful, we do get pretty good compensation for this. Let's say the knight takes back, and we sink our knight into c5, right? Now the bishop's under attack, we might seize the bishop, I guess. That's not particularly too important. What's more important is that white's pieces are pretty badly tied down, right? e5 is probably going to come with some pretty nice ramifications for this knight, but if any of these four pieces were to move, the pressure on e4 would start to build, and well, in this case, black has a more than a playable position. If they were to ever capture our knight somehow, we would of course repair the structure. So, in this case, we are taking our doubled pawns, but we are getting some good compensation. And if white never pushes e4, then we don't even have to worry too much about this. Alright, so that is the bishop takes line. Now, obviously, of course, they don't have to fold to the pressure immediately. What if they see that, oh, you're playing on the flank? The most principal way to strike back against an attack on the flank is to strike back in the center. So they go e4, right? And it looks like we did something wrong here, because white has this quite imposing pawn mass in the center. However, it's a bit too reckless to be expanding this early on, and we have to prove it. The only way we can prove it is to actually strike back in the center. We have to play d5. And this looks absolutely mad, right? How could you possibly just send a pawn in against a square that's controlled by multiple other pawns? But if you actually count the defenders, we're even. So it's not really that insane. So alright, there's a lot of things that white can possibly do, but pretty much they always transpose into a really weird version of the French defense pawn structure, right? Let's say c captures, right? E captures. Now, of course, if white takes our pawn, right, then suddenly this isn't looking so good for them, right? This isn't looking so good. Our c-pawn's coming in, our development's nice, we're about to castle. So if they're willing to like just split apart the center like that in exchange for an isolated queen's pawn position that isn't really in their favor, more power to them, but I don't think it's very good. Okay, so what else can they do? I think the most natural move for most people is to just advance the pawn, right? I mean, alternatively, you could try to defend it with f3, although f3 kind of falls because after you take back, then the queen check becomes kind of annoying, so that's not particularly good. So I think most people are going to start advancing the pawn. And in this case, right, if your opponent is claiming a lot of space, in the French defense, you have to target the weakness and create queenside play in order to make things work. And here, we do the same with c5. Striking back in the queenside, right? If they take our pawn, right, our bishop has a really nice way to just go back and recapture. So that's not too bad. Our isolated queen's pawn might be annoying, but we also have tremendous pressure on the e-pawn. And if f4 were to ever be played, then this pawn would actually be under serious attack. We could always go f6 if necessary. But for now, the main issue is the central tension. Most people are not going to take, right? They'll probably defend their center with knight f3, or something of that sort. We'll go knight e7, right? A standard French defense plan to shop the knight over there. Although, not quite in this case, because the pressure might be so burdening that we might actually go to g6 instead to start pressuring the e-pawn. Okay, bishop d3 played. Just continuing on development. We'll play bishop g4. Right? Our pressure is mounted towards the d-pawn, so it makes sense that we should pin down the defender of said pawn. Right? And this is the main benefit of this specific variation, right? Like normally in the French defense, your e6 pawn is blocking in the bishop. But here, since white has brazenly taken the center, we don't have an e-pawn anymore, which means that it no longer blocks the bishop. So that's pretty nice. Let's say the castle, right? Well, we're not in any rush to castle. Actually, if we castle immediately, there may be a nasty Greek gift on the line. So maybe not the best idea. So what in the meantime? Knight c6. Right, putting even more pressure on d5. At this point, white will probably take our bishop. Right, there isn't really too much of a better way to alleviate the tension on the center. And of course, if they were to ever take our bishop, right, note that it's actually better to insert the Zug of taking the knight first, attacking the queen, which pretty much diverts another defender away from the center. So of course, the queen's going to take back the bishop, and we, of course, are going to take back on d4, with a tempo on the queen, later to recapture the bishop with the a-pawn. And in this position, we can see that black's doing fine, I guess. The center is kind of frail. The queenside is kind of loose, but we're not really going to have too many problems, right? Our knight has a very nice outpost in the center. Our other knight will probably come in to support it, and this is not doing so badly. Okay. So that's why e4 doesn't work super well in these lines. Of course, it's not like white is losing or anything like with the other e4 lines, but it is something you have to be prepared for. And thankfully, it's not something that refutes this defense. Okay, e4 might not be played. So what might they play instead? Knight c3. This is actually a pretty tricky line. I've seen it recommended in a few courses against this specific defense. And the reason why is because if you play something like f5 or knight f6, it just doesn't work. For example, if you were to play knight f6 and be like, oh, I'm stopping e4. No, you're not stopping e4, because once they play e4, they take back, and you take the e-pawn. You're like, I'm winning. This is so nice. And then you get hit with queen g4 out of nowhere, and suddenly you're losing the g-pawn. And there's not really anything you could do to stop it. Oh well. I mean, I guess you could go here, but after f4, your knight is just kicked around. So, okay. Maybe not that, right? You can't do that. Okay, fine. But what about f5, right? What is the refutation for f5? Well, to be honest, white doesn't even have to engage in any conflicts here, right? They could just play e3 and be like, your position doesn't really make too much sense. You spent too much time playing around on the queen side, and it doesn't really work, right? They could just play e3. And calmly, white is just doing better, right? There's no pin on this knight. And if you were to ever be forced to take, then, they wouldn't even have to damage the structure, right? But also, it also does not stop e4. Hilariously, it also does not stop e4, right? If e4 were to ever come, and, I don't know, you take, then they take back with the knight. And this, this is bad. You might have to trade the bishops, but if you don't, then the knight just remains in the center, and that's not very good. Or if you remove the knight first, and they go here, then we're facing the same problem where the g-pawn is continuously under attack. So, we cannot just fight from the side here. It doesn't work, right? The only move to give us a playable position against knight c3 is d5. You have to go d5 and play this in sort of a weird Queen's Gambit decline style. Of course, you made the concession of playing a5, but that means that white can't expand on the queen side, and white has made the concession of oddly trying to unpin their knight, which isn't quite as common because most Queen's Gambit players prefer to have their bishop overpinning our knight, not unpinning their own knight. So right, d5 played. Right? a3. I mean, if it's not now, it'll probably come eventually. And in this case, we're taking the knight. Right? They'll take with the bishop. I mean, some people could take with the b-pawn and try to trade in the center. That's fine too, but again, it just kind of shreds the structure. Not the best idea. Okay. Knight f6, right? We have to get developing, and I guess the best way is to proactively stop e4. And so we will. e3 will probably be played. g3, of course, makes the bishop ineffective. It's blocked in by the d-pawn, which we can support with the c-pawn. So that's rather ineffective. Okay. So, knight f6 played. e3. b6, right? We're going for this wavy pawn structure, because in this case, it's controlling some very key dark squares. So, yeah. The c-pawn, of course, is blocking white from actually using their light square bishop, but if they were to ever somehow get their bishop here to check our king, we can always sack our bishop for it. So, not the biggest deal ever. And more importantly, this fights for the center in a very strange way, and it fights for the queen side also, allowing our bishop to finally fianchetto. Okay, that's pretty cool. Let's say white goes knight f3. Right? Just trying to complete their development. We'll go bishop a6. Right? Finally pinning down their c-pawn to their own bishop. And if white were, for example, to ever take, we could always take, deprive them of castling rights, and shove a knight into the center. So clearly, they're not going to take with the c-pawn. This stops that. But what else can they do? Well, after bishop a6 is played, white will probably continue on with their development. So maybe something like b3, supporting their center, right? Because at this moment we did have the d-pawn attacking it, we also had the bishop attacking it. So it makes sense that b3 would be played. However, b3 also kind of gives up any hope of queenside expansion with b4, because that would waste the tempo. Okay, we just kind of go on and do our own thing. We're gonna castle. Bishop b2 might be played. Bishop d3 might also be played. There's not too much of a difference between these. Knight e4, right? Of course, if the bishop were here, I could take, but I don't really think surrounding the bishop here like that's the best idea, because it dislodges the knight. So that's not really too big of a deal. So after knight e4 is played, queen c2 probably be played, but castling is also fine. Queen c2 might be played, and here... castling would actually be terrible because it would hang the bishop. So in this case, we'll take the opportunity to take off their dark squared bishop, which is pretty key, because their dark squared bishop could potentially open up later in the game. In any case, we'll take it off, and they'll also take off our knight. And in this case, there's actually a lot of good moves. You could play knight b8d2, you could play queen e7, or anything like that. But the best way to try and fight for equality is to actually start denying the queen side any advancement, right? So, we have to take. Pretty key move, we have to take. So if they ever take back, which they probably will with the b-pawn, now we go knight d7, and we can rotate our knight over to e4. That's the key idea. And of course, going e4 right now is a bit too brazen of a strike in the center. We can always strike back with c5 if necessary. Okay, knight d7 played. Let's say white castles, because that was the whole plan the entire time. Well, we played knight b to d7, not just to reroute to f6, but also to support the c5 break. So, rook a to b1 will probably be played, attacking our weak pawn, but our pawn is also supported by our pieces. So for now, it's not the best. It's not the worst ever. And after queen e7, we have a very clear plan. Their center is under attack by our c-pawn, and should a trade occur, more than likely it will either isolate the c-pawn, or it will give white hanging pawns in a place where we actually are threatening quite a few trades. Why? Because this c-pawn can never move, therefore this bishop can never move, because otherwise we would get a trade. Okay, this knight probably doesn't want to trade itself off for our knight, and our rooks are going to have open d and c files to play with, which are going to beam down against the hanging pawns. So, this is a pretty nice position for white and for black. There's a lot to play for here. Positions roughly about equal. Okay, so that's knight c3. Okay, but what if they don't go knight c3, right? Well, they can also go e3 or g3. This is also the reason why we're not covering knight f3 right now, because it just transposes into the g3 or the e3 systems later. Okay, so e3 might also be played if white wants to just have a calm, developing game, more natural to d4. And of course, e3 is not necessarily a bad move, but it's not quite as challenging as the more ambitious options here. So okay, e3 played, we'll play knight f6, trying to stop e4. I mean, if they were to play e4, they'd have to waste tempo and lose a pawn, so that is to our favor. Knight f3, continuing development, b6, because we want to fianchetto our bishop. Bishop d3, continuing development, bishop b7, castles, castles. Knight c3, trying to contest the center. And this might look similar to the lines where they play knight c6 immediately, but it's a little bit different because in this case, we have committed our bishop to b2, trying to stop e4, as opposed to a6, trying to attack the c-pawn. And of course, there's not too much of a difference, but we are going to strike back with d5. So, d5 we go. Okay, in this case, white actually can take back with the c-pawn, because it's not pinned to their bishop. Okay, very cool. They'll take. And we'll take back with the e-pawn. Taking back with the queen, of course, hangs the queen. Taking back with the knight is a little bit suboptimal, because we want to have the open file for our rook. Okay, so from here, knight e5 is by far the most common move, and probably the best way for white to start making progress. Queen c2 could also be played, but in the meantime, we would just keep on waiting. Okay, knight b to d7, challenging the knight for central control. And strangely enough, right, like knight e5 is the most common move prior to this. Guess what? The most common move in this position is not the best one. The most common move, which appears in over 90% of master games, and over 80% of online chess games of all levels, probably the only move you really need to really know how to play against, is f4, continuing to put the knight into the center. And it makes sense, right? Because if you just kind of ignore it, we'll play rook e1 or queen c2 eventually, and pick off the knight and win one of the pawns. Okay, f4 is played. In this case, our plan is to initiate a long string of positional trades that benefit us. What do I mean by this? First off, we take the knight. Take the c3 knight, right? Because we're eliminating defenders of the weak light squares. They'll take back, of course, with the pawn. They might take back with the bishop. But if they were to take back with the bishop, it kind of doesn't do anything, right? Like, if they took back, the bishop stares into a pawn that's defended by another pawn that's defended by another pawn, or it stares into its own pawn, which doesn't do anything. So at least some people prefer to at least have this, like, stonewall structure in the meantime. Okay. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to play bishop a6 at last, reactivating our bishop, but also further eliminating defenses of the weak light squares. In this case, the bishop is pinned down to the rook, so either you're winning in exchange, or at least you're forcing a pretty decent trade. Of course, they're going to take, right, we take back, and they're going to play something like queen e2, right, attack our rook. And after we back up, we can now, well, we can't do this right now because white has a move. I don't know, let's say rook plays, I don't know, rook f to d1. Right, honestly, there's a lot of different moves white can make with the rooks, but their dark square bishop is dead, their knight is dead. The queen is probably not going to move again, so they'll probably move one of the rooks, and after this, we sink the knight into e5. And this is just complete positional domination by white. No, by black, because our knight is never going to be smoked out of that outpost, and we can smoke white's knight out pretty easily with our own. In this case, we have a very nice knight, our pawn structure is very solid, and I don't really see too much reason to complain in this case. Going e3 immediately and following the most common moves is something that can lead to a bit of a problem for white. Alright. Okay, so maybe they don't go e3. Maybe from the starting position, they'll go g3 instead, trying to basically go into a rip-off Catalan. Alright, we'll oblige. Knight f6 played, bishop out, castle, knight f3. And after knight f3, of course, we do have a big split of things we can play. b6 immediately is not the best idea because white already fianchetted their bishop. Although you could play like that if you want to, but the best way to try and equalize is to strike back in the center with d5. Alright, white's going to castle, ignoring us. And the best way for us to equalize is to indeed take the pawn. So we are going to have a loose queenside position. In exchange, we're going to have nice queenside space and some pretty solid development. If, of course, this is not to your taste, you can instead, of course, go for b6 earlier, or you can go for d6 instead of d5 and try to break through with e5 later on in the match, playing more in the style of Bogo-Indian Defense. But this is the best way to equalize, so we're going with it. After d5 is played, and white castles, d takes e5, and queen c2 is going to be played to further attack our c-pawn. In this case, of course, white has moved the queen, so we have to take the bishop, right? Otherwise, the bishop may leave, and suddenly our bishop isn't really doing very much on that diagonal. They'll take back with the knight, and we have to defend our pawn, preferably with another pawn, so b5 is going to be played. Alright. In this case, white is going to strike back with a4. Of course, if they don't play a4, then, you know, we have a very nice queenside position. There isn't very much white can do about that. a4 is going to be played, and we're going to play c6. which is defended by our knight, of course, to further bolster our queenside position. b3 will be played, trying to chip away, and of course we're going to take, and they're going to take back, probably not with the queen, so probably with the knight. b4 has to be played, so that we can try and get an outside passer as soon as possible. Knight e5 played, knight d5 played. And, well, I mean, the position's not really too special, it's also not too horrible either. Alright, knight d5 played, knight takes e6, knight takes back, queen takes c6, rook a6, trying to attack the queen and start getting some queenside development. And here the queen can run back to quite a few places, honestly. The best one is c4, so say queen c4 is played, further keeping some tension. Knight c3. Just jumping our knight further on into white's position. Let's see, knight c5 will be played, so getting into our position as well. Here, no, things aren't too bad for either side. Rook d6 seems to be the best option, putting more pressure on the weak d-pawn. e3 is going to be played, and here we can pretty clearly see the position starting to form. We have a pretty dominant knight, we have an outside pass pawn, but we have a couple of active pieces that we would like to trade off from white. Some natural moves that might follow, of course, include bishop a6, once we are able to dislodge this knight, which that will be a big threat coming in the future. But until we do that, of course, we would like to play moves like, queen c2, continuing to put pressure on their position, bringing one of our rooks over. Once we dislodge the knight, then bring the bishop over. So our plans are pretty nice and not too bad here. So alright, even though we do have quite a bit of sacrifice to make with a loose queenside position, I'd say it's pretty worth it, all things considered. And if white ever screws up at any point prior to this, then our position could be a little more dominant. For example, if they don't go a4 and challenge our queenside, then, there's not even a loose queenside to speak of. Now, of course, in this case, we assume that white castles on move 7, but they don't have to castle, right? A more challenging option is actually to go queen c2 immediately. Queen c2 delays development by a little bit, but immediately starts some pressure down our position. Alright, well, I'll oblige. In this case, the best move is to go c5 and strike back immediately in the center, creating massive tension with the full tension. At master level, there is pretty much one forcing line for a lot of different moves, so we're going to go over that. In this case, the theory move is going to be c takes d5. And while we could recapture the pawn, they could capture back and give us an isolated pawn. It's not really the best ever, so we're going to completely explode the center by taking on d4. Now, of course, if white continues to be greedy, sure, we might lose a pawn, but our development's going to be so very active, it's going to be a lot of compensation as a result. So they're not going to continue grabbing our e-pawn in that case. Well, alright then. Knight takes d4, opening up their bishop. We are going to play queen b6, attacking their knight. Right, just a nice little Zuchenzuke in the meantime before we actually capture off the pawn, improving the position of our queen. Okay, e3 will be played, solidifying their knight. At long last, we're going to take back. We shouldn't take back with the knight. I mean, we could, but then they would just sacrifice their bishop, give us isolated queen's pawn anyway. And we would be down one more trade, so maybe not the best idea. So alright, after e takes d5, and white finally castles on move 11, knight c6 will be played, trying to bring us down. Knight c6, trying to contest white's dominant knight, which is in front of the pawn. And of course, trades wouldn't be the best thing ever, but in this case, it gives us hanging pawns, which is slightly better to play because it blunts the bishop completely. Alright, after knight c6 is played, they'll probably take. I don't really see a better move, because if they don't take, they're going to start losing their d-pawn. Okay, well, we'll oblige, right, and capture back with b takes e6. Rook c1, probably be played, trying to put more pressure on this pawn. And as it turns out, the move I recommend for us is bishop d7, continuing to defend it, and just connecting the rooks. However, more ambitious alternatives include queen a6, trying to sneak into the back rank and get into a pretty decent endgame. Bishop a6, bishop e6, just being more ambitious and sacrificing the pawn. Frankly, this pawn isn't, like, yeah, it's a pawn, but it's not the most important pawn ever in our position. And you could either play for an endgame or a pretty dynamic, open, middle game position, whichever you prefer. However, I recommend bishop d7 because we don't want to lose the pawn, and this bishop doesn't really have a better square to go to in the meantime. Knight c3 will be played. We'll play queen a6, because white is planning to start attacking our queen, so might as well get out of the way as early as possible. Of course, taking the knight is not the best idea, because it just gives white more activity. Alright then. Queen a6 played. Knight a4 is going to be played anyway, because they're going to sink their knight in front of our pawn, and that's going to happen. We'll play queen e2, sneaking into the back rank. Bishop e1 is going to be played. Of course, initiating a trade. Will, of course, oblige. Takes. And here, of course, we are also going to just keep the tension. We'll play rook f to b8, starting some active play on the queen side. Now, of course, eventually they'll play a3. Let's say they play it now, right? Well, if they play it now, we snipe off the bishop, and they'll take back with their rook. After king f8, the endgame has begun. But in this case, it's pretty clear to see that both sides are roughly evenly matched. Like, yeah, our king is slightly better than theirs in this case. Their bishop is staring into a bunch of pawns, but so is ours, and it's not really too much of a difference. Our knight, of course, is going to be pretty glorious, and theirs is also going to be pretty good. Our rooks are easily activatable, and this rook f to b8 move already sets up an attack on their b-pawn once the knight were to move. We can say that this is an endgame position. It's roughly even, and nothing too bad for either way. This is all theory, all theory. Alright. The last variation I have to go over is white forcing the issue with a3. Most people don't give this line enough credit. Actually, a3 comes very, very close to outright refuting this defense in computer play, pretty much. Alright, but your opponent's not going to play like a computer, and there's a lot of counterintuitive moves needed for white to try and gain a big advantage. In this case, of course, we take the bishop. That's kind of the point of this defense. Now there are two different things that white can do. They can take back with the queen, or they can take back with the knight. If they take back with the knight, this is the significantly less challenging option and does not even come close to refuting our defense. In this case, knight takes back. We'll go knight f6, of course. This doesn't stop e4, they can play it anyway. But again, e4 is always going to be met with d5, a strike in the center. So, not too terrible of an option. In fact, let's show it e4, right? d6, just keeping the center very solid. Knight g to f3 will be played, and we will castle. Bishop d3 will be played, just continuing to put their pieces out, and we will play knight b to d7, further preparing e5 break. White will castle, and we will break through with e5. Now, rook e1 or some other move might be played. To be honest, there really aren't too many moves for white, because if they don't defend this pawn, there may be some problems later in the future. Okay, well, in this case, if they continue to defend, we will take off the d-pawn. And this is pretty good for us, for a solo reason, because it denies white complete control of the center, and gives us some very nice outposts with our own knight. Of course, they're going to take with their knight. That is by default. Now from here, knight c5 would be played. Knight e5 is also fine, although I don't really like the idea of running into f5 quite as much. b5 here is stopped because of our a-pawn, so yeah, c5 seems to be a better square for this. In any case, we are attacking the a-pawn, and that is probably going to be our main source of attack here. Say that bishop c2 is played, because at the moment the bishop was hanging. Well, we'll also play rook e1, and our plan is quite simple. It's to attack e4. Now, of course, f3 could be played at any time, but again, that seems a little dangerous because we could play c6 and get our queen over to this diagonal, where there may be some kind of discover check in the future. Furthermore, it also weakens this specific square significantly, so if we could ever shove a knight onto there, then white might start having problems. And lastly, of course, f3 completely, utterly hems in this knight, hems in this bishop. So, maybe not the best idea for white. In this case, we have a very obvious target of attack, with the knight takes d2 lines. So, not to worry, this is completely fine for white, and also completely fine for black. It's roughly even. But the real most challenging line, the one that almost refutes this defense, is queen takes. Right? So the problem here is if you go something like knight f6, and you try to play d6 and e5, it's too slow. White is going to get their knight out immediately and start castling queenside, e5, and frankly, they're just going to break through in the center while your king's still in the center. So maybe not the best idea to try and go for this. And if you don't go for that immediately, they can always just try to clamp down with f5, or just like this. And it's just very nasty. White has so much to play for in this case because the queenside's already completely developed. And we are actually on the receiving end of this punishment. So I don't recommend going knight f6 here. I think that's not the best idea. But, of course, you could if you want to. d5 is a totally fine option if you want to go for this kind of thing. But the problem is that trying to directly engage and take the fight to white's center is probably not the best idea. They can always recapture, and once we recapture, they can always just calmly develop and go after our weak central pawn, right? If we ever go c6, then a4 is going to start, a5 is going to start looking pretty weak. So maybe we don't want to directly confront white's center, right? Alright, how else do we do it? I actually found a pretty nice idea that is pretty much as good as the knight f6 lines, but doesn't exactly take the fight to white's center and instead tries to control it from a distance. What do I mean? I mean f5, taking in the spirit of the Dutch defense. In this position, f5 happens around like 5% of the time, but black pretty much has a completely even score with white after f5. Well, alright then, f5. What a nice idea, right? Knight c3 will probably be played, trying to gain control over e4, and we will retaliate with knight f6. Right? And this is the point of the f-pawn. White doesn't really have a way to exploit the weakness of our king that was created, because our e6 pawn is still there. However, we can more easily stop it if we use more of our pawns and forces to try and stop it. Well, alright then. Knight f6 played. Let's say knight f3 is played, right? f3 trying to break through with e4 doesn't really work. Mostly because it's a bit too slow, and there isn't really a need to do that. But, you know, they can if they want to. Okay, after knight f3, we castle. And g3 will probably be played. e3, of course, makes the bishop just kind of stare into nothing. So g3 will be played. If not now, then at some other time. Well, alright then. We have to rush to get our bishop on the diagonal too, so let's play b6. Bishop's going to diagonals. White castles. Knight e4. Because white can't really kick out our knight with f3, since their knight's already there. More than likely, they're going to capture with the c knight, and we'll capture back with the bishop. b4 will be played, and we'll play queen e3. Queen e7. And in this position, we have a not too confrontational approach, but white has a very overextended center. So we have a big target of attack. Eventually in the future, we might play moves like d6, knight b d7, take the pawns and try to slide the rook in so we can attack the pawn. But for now, our position's pretty solid, and there's not too much to worry about. If white were to ever take our pawn, for example, the rook comes in, and white's queenside is completely shattered. Well, alright then. That is this defense. The main theory line's covered. There's quite a bit to learn with this defense, and I may have made some mistakes along the way. However, I think I put together a pretty nice repertoire for the Keres defense, and I hope that this helps somebody. Thank you.